When we were thinking about this topic for tonight, and we found it a little bit. Well, I guess we thought it would be best to play sections of a tape that was recorded back in 1977, a talk that Jim Tepfer gave at the Institute of World Culture with adult education. And he can bring up more of context.
Let me give you the background just so you understand. The talk was originally, it was part of a series of 4 talks given in conjunction with adult education in Santa Barbara. And the theme was civilization and self-consciousness. And so the first talk was to be given by Professor Iyer, by Raghavan Iyer. And I did receive a phone call from, I was the moderator for the series. I received a call from him a couple hours before the meeting saying that something had come up and he could not go and give the talk, but asked if I would be willing to give it. I said, certainly, and then avoided fainting. And then nonetheless, he came back and said, look, why don't you just listen to what I'm saying? I'm going to give you the key points of what I would have said. So I listened to everything that he said, and then I thanked him, I hung up, and then I sat down and composed points, what we call PowerPoints in relation to the main points that he mentioned over about a 25-minute period. So it ended up being a talk. It lasted about an hour, and then after that, there were questions and answers for about another 30 minutes. It actually was a very wonderful occasion, I have to say. It was a marvelous occasion. The place was packed, but more importantly, after the initial disappointment, which there was, a deflation went down in the entire audience, but nonetheless, that was to be expected. So then I began the talk. What we're going to do is we're going to pick up the first part. Why? Because it provides conceptual clarification of the fundamental concepts about civilization. Then what we're going to do is go to the last portion of the talk, which is about individuation and universalization and how it applies to contemporary times. So that, I think, gives us a good balance of conceptual clarification and then in terms of how it relates to the contemporary world. So that said, we can go ahead and begin. By the way, we will have probably 35 minutes for people to raise questions or make observations in relation to the topic. So there will still be plenty of time left.
Of course, ask ourselves a series of questions in relation to the whole idea, to the whole concept of what is civilization. And in thinking about it, we might come up with a series of different conceptions in relation to civilization. And indeed, we might notice in perusing the history that in fact it has been formulated in different ways and undoubtedly has been exemplified and embodied in cultures in different senses of the term. We can think of civilization fundamentally perhaps in terms of an ordering principle, the idea of order, that of proportion, that of harmony. We might think of it in terms of the use made of the resources of the human mind and heart, in terms of the resources of human knowledge, in terms of law. In fact, very often we think in terms of civilization, in terms of a civil culture or a civil society, referring not only, of course, to laws, to rules which regulate our conduct, but at the core of that, of course, is an ethical idea dealing with individual self-reference, individual conduct, in which appeals, in a sense, to individual conscience. So even as we begin some minimal effort to conceptualize the very idea of civilization, we see that while we might begin with knowledge, we might begin with resources, we might refer to laws, in the end, there's a self-reference, or there's a reference to an inner core, which has, in some degree, to do with what an individual is. In its broadest sense, we might think of civilization, or perhaps we might want to use the cognitive term culture in a very positive, dynamic sense. as referring to rationality of judgment, rectitude of conduct, and refinement of taste. These are three very powerful phrases which help us to form a triadic focal point in relation to this evening's discussion. And I'll repeat that again: rationality of judgment, rectitude of conduct, and refinement of taste. And in fact, if we use these threefold points as elementary criteria by which we might look at civilization and simultaneously at consciousness and self-consciousness, we can, of course, span the whole horizon of history in a sense and say that the rise and falls of civilizations are ultimately bound up with the capacity of a civilization, of a given civil society, to embody and to exemplify these three ideas. And in a sense, we can put it in a different way. We might say that it has to do with the concern. If we want to reformulate the idea, we might say it has to do with the concern in any given culture, any given society, with meaning, with the exploration of that which refines and enriches the mind in its capacity for selection, that which deepens the feelings and allows the feelings to be expressed and manifest through a variety of different modes, from art to music to literature to poetry, whatever. And when a civilization is in a sense on a decline, perhaps we might say that that civilization is ultimately bound up, trapped in its own formulations, its own rules, its own level of achievement, experience, and knowledge, and in a sense bound up in ritual. And this is when a civilization begins to decline. The deep search for meaning that we find exemplified in different traditions, from India to Greece to China, even to early America, is something that is characteristic of essentially vital civilization, and it's integral to the whole idea of consciousness and of self-consciousness. Indeed, it would be impossible to conceive of civilization in this sense, which relates to us as subjects, without thinking fundamentally about the whole idea of self-consciousness. Of course, in thinking about perhaps what is involved in becoming civilized, in elevating the level of civilization, of what it means to be civil, to be a civil human being, we're talking in a sense, and we have been talking implicitly, about the idea of consideration for other human beings. Now, this is really very critical. If we study culture at all, if we examine past civilizations, if we contemplate the present and think of the future, we have to see that civilization is ultimately bound up, and being civil is bound up with the idea of consideration, awareness, sensitivity to the existence, to the needs of other human beings. This is critical because it really, by being aware of this, by being willing to define it in this way, in a sense what one is saying is our very rather adolescent ideas of egotism are very in fact the egoic concepts that we have evolved of ourselves really have no meaning in this context. In a sense, civility, the very notion of civility, the very effort to embody it in a culture, in institutions, in rules and laws, in a sense is a negation of the aggressive, grasping, kind of very shallow, superficial egotism that evolves in a culture that is failing, or a culture that is in difficulty. So that this notion of civility at its core involves the idea of self-expansion, the idea of self-awareness being refined and developed until it's a larger and larger circle, encompassing more and more human beings in a very fundamental way. We could say in a sense that a concern, a real existential, authentic concern for others leads to a questioning of what are the causes behind the phenomena of life. And pursuing deeper into that, of course, we make different kinds of discoveries. And those discoveries become something that we can incorporate and manifest through our very conduct and our very mode of responding to other human beings. We might also say that A consideration for others is really, in a sense, what institutions, we might call them civilizing agents, civilizing agencies, such as the family, educational institutions, marriage as an institution, work as an institution, are all ultimately, in some quintessential sense, concerned with protecting and promoting some idea of a larger awareness of other human beings, the growth, development, the pain, the suffering, and the promise of every individual life. Now, in speaking about civilizing agencies as such, or civilizing institutions, we have to think in terms of what these institutions might be, what might be called these civilizing agencies. In a sense, we can make an elementary distinction and distinguish between what we might call natural institutions and artificial or perhaps contrived institutions. By the way, the idea of contrived institutions actually has a more finer meaning to it than we're able to lend in a more technological age. It originally had to do with men cooperatively and constructively visualizing modes of relating to each other, patterns of living that were reflective of something very fundamental to the human heart and the human mind, and that would promote collective growth. Nonetheless, in thinking of natural institutions, of what are the natural civilizing elements in any given culture, we think, of course, initially of the family. This, of course, the family is not an institution, quote unquote, in which we enter by choice. We do not choose our relatives, we do not choose our family. On the other hand, even though there is no choice in that sense, there is still the opportunity by each individual as an emerging thinking and rational and moral agent, as an emerging thinking and moral agent, to learn, to benefit from the surrogate overseeing of parents, to assimilate the very essence of what the mother might communicate through perhaps the finer graces of patience, of suffering, the ability to identify with others, the capacity of the father to assume responsibility, to maintain initiative, to be a protector. There's still the opportunity for us as emerging young minds and hearts to assimilate something from that natural institution. And our response to that institution, our response to the family as a living nucleus, providing for the development and involvement of character, is determined in terms of our response. We can respond in such a way that we do indeed maximize the opportunities, and perhaps that is how the family, in a noble sense, can be seen. And you might say, in another sense, it is a training ground, a ground for discipline, a ground in which we can see at an early age, all individuals, all children can see, that responsibilities are built into life, that there are many, many cycles in life, and that one can face those and learn from them. Of course, another institution is the institution of education, and we have here a whole variety from primary to high school to college. And perhaps if one is looking for the essential element in regard to education in some fundamental sense, we would be thinking in terms perhaps of friendship. Friendship perhaps in an Emersonian sense. Friendship in the sense that you form relationships with other adolescents, other growing individuals who are not related through family ties. There's an element of transcendence of normal familial ties, relationships that are blood relationships, and there can be a coming together and an encounter amongst individuals on an entirely different basis, an entirely different standpoint, with different sets of expectations, and we're calling for different qualities in our character. There is the whole idea, in a sense, of coming together out of shared interest, out of, in a sense, perhaps as education matures, out of a deep desire to understand ideas and to be able to communicate them through a variety of ways, not simply including speech and writing. So education, which has to do with the capacity to draw out of the emerging mind and consciousness, the development of reason and the strengthening of the heart and the will can be seen as a civilizing agent, a carrier of the best traditions of the past and an opening of the possibilities, undefined possibilities, unknown possibilities of the future. Of course, a third institution as such, what we might call a natural institution, is that of marriage. And in thinking of marriage, we might perhaps think that what is a defining characteristic of this relationship is perhaps one of commitment. It is in fact a great teacher of the meaning of commitment, of the possibility of a creative relationship, but undoubtedly one that involves commitment and also in many, many different ways involves the will. And that has, of course, a variety of meanings when we look in terms of different cultures and how that has been dealt with. Of course, we have others, and a very critical one, particularly a critical one in our own society because we spend so much time in it, in a sense, is work. As civilizing agent, work, in a sense, provides different patterns by which we can learn through some kind of role definition, some kind of role responsibility, a specialization, in a sense, growing through specialization is also possible within a work situation. And the idea of men and women coming together in some context, even where there are roles, even where there is specialization, but with an opportunity to assimilate each other's talents and abilities and sense of discrimination, and of course in some other sense to promote a purpose, if an institution serves a purpose, which is social and collective. So again, in this sense, work is an opportunity for a further enhancement of becoming more civil or becoming more civilized. It has to do with a harnessing of energy, in relation to some collective purpose to which has been imputed to the institution or the various kind of activity in which one is engaged. So in that sense, again, work can be seen as a civilizing agent. We might also think of something that is very critical in importance to us as Americans, and that is the use of leisure time. This is a problem, we might say, or a question that is very important. The whole idea of creative use of leisure, what does that fundamentally involve? Why is it such an important idea? And perhaps creative leisure is really bound up with a refinement, a strengthening, and an unfoldment of the mind, and also, of course, a refinement of the emotions. If we think of art, or we think of, and whether we're speaking here of painting, whether we're speaking of poetry, or whether we're even speaking of literature, which is of extreme importance in terms of the kinds of things we read, how we nourish the mind, what it is we feed the faculties with, so to speak, whether that which we does expands and strengthens the will, whether it debilitates the will, whether we're involved in various kinds of imagery which make us susceptible to the lesser features of any given culture. This is all exceedingly important. So the arts, the crafts would be important here, and perhaps in a more civilized society we would find that crafts as a form of leisure activity would be a great strengthener because it has a non-utilitarian basis. So often it's easy for crafts to develop into something that is bound up with capital, bound up with economic survival or other things of this sort. But if we're thinking of crafts in terms of leisure, we have to think in terms of something which is, in a sense, regenerative and not bound up with a utilitarian consideration. We have also, of course, something that we're in a position to experience that we have all, in a sense, participated in, and that's the idea of the use. One of the best uses of leisure is the idea of a lifelong education. Not to see education in terms of specific contexts, specific institutions, in terms of a period of life which we mark off arbitrarily and say, during this period of life, during this phase, this is when instruction, this is when living, this is when learning, that is, learning can occur. And then binding that up in a sense with the next stage. So that not only is it seen in terms of a series of stages which are arbitrarily divided and presupposing that we can anticipate death and know that we'll in fact make it through that stage, but furthermore we tend to bind it up with the next stage. And here we should see things in terms of a lifelong line of learning and of education which can in fact be continued up until the evening of our lives. And here, of course, the concept of the community college, the concept of adult education, plays a very important and critical role, and there are other ways, and undoubtedly, in which a culture can generate means of providing a lifelong education. Bellamy addressed himself to this, saw as part of his ideal vision of what the future society could be like, with the idea that in fact, at the age of 40, people could retire, but they would continue and maintain what is, in a sense, the golden thread of their life, which is a quest, a mental and moral quest, we might say, but a quest for knowledge, for expansion, for an ability to participate in the very finest offerings that have been made by the human mind in a given civilization or in the world as a whole. So lifelong education would be particularly important. Now, in a sense, pointing or kind of characterizing something about what civilization might be like and self-consciousness, something about the modes in which, or the institutions and agencies through which self-consciousness might emerge, might be refined and elevated. We might ask ourselves the question, well, in a sense, where do we turn in relation to trying to enhance our understanding of civilization? Are there options? Are there places, in fact, that we can turn to as streams or sources by which we can drink and participate of something that will make this more of a reality instead of simply an archetype? And of course, we have tremendous ancient legacies to which we can defer and to which we can, you might say, learn from and make obeisance to, but in, of course, a constructive and alert way. And we might say, in a sense, what are we looking for? In looking to past civilizations, we're not concerned with forms. We're not concerned with rituals and rules and practices, so much, perhaps, as with ideas, as with concepts, as with values, and the vital, unique, and manifold ways in which different cultures attempted to formulate what these were, point in different directions for exploration. Speaking here now in terms of the frontiers of being, as Emerson might put it, not simply in terms of some other, perhaps more superficial idea of intellectual study, but seeing this turning to the past, to the ancient civilizations of bygone times, not as an intellectual endeavor, so much as an attempt to, in effect, affect the whole of the thinking that we have and open us up to new possibilities and to new kinds of self-transformation and self-change. Now, when we look back and purview several thousand years of history, the art of the simple, and of seeing meaning in the simple. And of course, we can think in terms of the problems of marriage, the problems we find in work that have already been alluded to, and whatnot. So, in a sense, all of this really leads us, perhaps, to, more than anything else, I would suppose, to see that we're talking in the end about individuation. Perhaps fundamentally, when we're talking about civilization and self-consciousness, we're talking really, in a sense, about individualization and universalization. The dialectic between these two ideas, these two human processes, which are not automatic, which are a function of individual effort, resolve, dedication, and determination, which can be aided by a society through its institutions, through the ability of institutions to correct themselves, through the ability of institutions to regenerate themselves by allowing access to individuals who are truly innovative and not afraid to take risk. But nonetheless, it does seem to get down to the whole idea that we're talking, in a sense, about individualization and universalization. Perhaps we see this very difficult in modern civilization for an individual to become an individual, to really have a grip on themselves, to really have evolved a sense of their own destiny, of where they want to go, of what is really of vital importance to them, of what is not of vital importance to them, of the ways in which they are fooled by what at one time they think is important but later discover is not. The very way in which we see other human beings very often is a challenge as to whether or not we are individuals. If we see them in terms of very limited images, that of which they immediately manifest in any given situation because of mood, because of tendency, because of weakness, because of strength or whatever, if we see them in terms of that image, we're not seeing them as an individual. That says something about ourselves. We have not yet really individuated. We haven't yet inquired into causes and seen that there are things in a human being that cannot be easily manifest. There is such a thing as skill, and skill in relationship, skill in encounter, so that what is a deeper level can in fact be manifest beyond a person's seeming abilities or talents or roles. And so this is indeed critical, and perhaps this is why we see today in America such an intense interest in what we might call new formulations of religion or religious philosophy. We see the influence of Zen Buddhism in America. We see an tremendous influence in general from the East, in terms of yoga as well as in terms of Zen Buddhism, in terms of an interest in even turning to some of the social forms of expression of Hinduism, of the different stages of life, in terms of an effort to regenerate the whole idea of community. And this is not very easy to regenerate the idea of community. We've had many attempts to experiment with the commune, but this is exceedingly important that this effort be made. We see in psychology a tremendous movement away from purely, as we know, a pathological consideration of psychology, or in a sense to be involved in psychology, to study psychology on one own, to read books in psychology, to take courses in psychology, is an implicit recognition that one is either concerned with the diseases of the mind, or one has a few oneself that one wants to cure. And perhaps it's a happier thought to think that we can now turn to a consideration in a larger sense of psychology, to books which are moving more toward a healthier conception, even in a sense to ideas which are difficult to validate in experience. And this, in a sense, is a connecting up with the broader movement in religion that is being stirred, whether you're speaking about fundamentally establishing a relationship with Christ that is more direct and spontaneous, or whether you're speaking about some form of yoga. So these are all, in a sense, signs of the awakening effort to establish individuality, or what it means to be an individual, what Socrates, in a sense, exemplified, and many others have too. We also see a greater universalization in the sense that there is a much larger awareness of humanity as a whole. Our categories of thought that are bound up with nationalism, that are bound up with race, that are bound up with parochial concerns, have really weakened. Not uniformly throughout the world, because there are many differences and the world is very complex at this point, with different nationalism being stronger in certain areas and weakening in other areas. But nonetheless, there is a larger awareness that we are collectively bound up in some way that is very, very inescapable and fundamental. And this is seen most clearly, in fact, for some period of time, through economic considerations more than any other. We are aware, perhaps through our vulnerability as a country, that in fact we are part of a larger network of needs and interest throughout the world. And if oil is withdrawn, we are indeed quite vulnerable. And we do have to suddenly think about the existence of our brother Arabs as something more than providers who will keep their place and provide us with the oil that we need at the prices that we wish. So this is just, of course, a very minor example, but there are many ways, I think, in which we see that we are, in fact, and there are these tremendous shifts, perhaps, that are taking place in the locuses of power throughout the world. And this is involving a tremendous psychological change and adjustment. The larger nations are suddenly now becoming aware of the fact carrying a big stick does not necessarily speak very loudly. There's too many instances in which it's clear that one has to make arguments on grounds other than simply one's position as power or in terms of self-interest. And this is going to involve a tremendous amount of readjustment, perhaps, and a new kind of psychological mobility and political mobility will perhaps have to emerge. We see this to some extent, undoubtedly, in the thinking of Buckminster Fuller in his speaking of world resources. We see it, of course, also in Toynbee in his studies of history and his statements that really we are inheritors of a tremendous array of human resources that we can learn from, and particularly travel, in a sense, being very critical. If we are willing to be observant, we can learn a great deal, and we can break down and dissolve the differences that arise out of various problems that have arisen over a period of centuries. We might also think here, just parenthetically, of Schumacher, who has recently been to Adulthood and spoken of the ways in which the Western technology can be creatively used in relation to, quote, the developing nations of the world, which, as he points out very readily, constitute 80% of humanity. What in fact seems to be happening is the 20% of humanity is really becoming aware of the 80% of humanity. And it's probably a point at which there will be no choice about the matter, and we will have to begin to think in much, much larger terms than we currently do. This, of course, forces us all, regardless of our role, whether we're a student, whether we're someone with public responsibilities, whether we are someone who's still searching and doing the minimals in terms of society, but doing the maximal in terms of an internal quest and questioning. It does force us to raise a number of questions and to really engage in a search, which is perhaps forerunning any kind of new civilization. It's a necessary search. It's a kind of purification that is necessary. And this kind of questioning itself really raises the level of consciousness, of self-awareness. Because, of course, if you think in terms of a new civilization, what we're thinking in terms of is a new kind of self-awareness. And this will undoubtedly involve, it would make sense that it involves a new type of person, a new kind of individual that evolves, that undoubtedly we can find models for that if we look into different cultures, whether we look to a Thoreau, whether we look to an Emerson, who represent different types of manhood, and of course here we mean males and females, but nonetheless a new type of person will evolve. But perhaps this will be intimately itself bound up with the idea of the changes that have to occur in consciousness per se. Changes in consciousness. What does this mean? What does this involve? It's difficult to really formulate this, but one thinks that it is involved with changing our way of conceptualizing ourselves in the world. It has to do with concepts, as we mentioned at the beginning about civilization. It has to do with a re-examination of principles and of values, and these, in a sense, and of models as well. And perhaps this is what is going to have to change so radically radically for us to evolve a new civilization, or at least a civilization which is more wholesome and more meaningful than modern civilization. In the end, we might say that the whole idea of self-consciousness has really to do with depth as well as breadth. What is the element of depth? Perhaps the element of depth is that of individualization, of becoming an individual, of being authentic, of being clear as to what one wants, to what one is willing to pay for it and do for it. So depth has to do with becoming more of an individual, responding and acting more from what we really think and what we really feel in our finest moments, and connecting that with the very challenges and opportunities and situations that we actually have and cannot avoid in the world. To be an individual, in a sense, is to develop the ability to connect between the finest reflection, sifting that one can do with what seem to be the opportunities and the challenges of the world in which we live, including the everyday encounter in human relationships which are so critical. Because after all, it's really in the realm of interaction with other human beings of different ages, of different classes, of different roles, that things are really critical. Being able not just to speak a certain language that is abstract and that is noble and that is ethical, but being able to see how that can connect with the very persons that one deals with, which perhaps involves a great deal of negation of what seems to be apparently true about the person, about the relationship, about ourselves in that context, and being able to really think about it so hard that through pain, through searching, begin to make real connections that we hold on to and do not give up on, and therefore we begin to build something new and something real. And of course, anything like this involves death as well, in the sense of dying out of the old patterns of relating, old attitudes, old responses, which are very, very difficult to root out. But simultaneous with depth, if depth is involved in self-consciousness versus citizens of a world civilization, and the balance, of course, it becomes critical between these two. We can become we can expand our scope of concern and of interest in such a wide circle of interest that, in fact, if we're not careful, we can become superficial. It's a bit like being the intellectual who has studied all the religions of the world and can speak for hours on various kinds of subtle distinctions made within various religions. But in a sense, if that person takes one idea and looks and uses it as a fulcrum for examination, for pulling through threads in his or her own life, then they might find that, in fact, the meaning of it all is really very superficial. They become too broad in their scope, and there's really no depth. On the other hand, of course, an individual can be very much concerned with being self-reliant, a person of integrity, a person who is correct, upright, strong, unafraid, and yet, because of a lack of breadth, because of a lack of interest in other people's problems, and other people's ways of exemplifying strength, heroism, endurance, patience, how they exercise their judgment, and so forth and so on, there's a kind of narrowness. There's a limit on the horizon of awareness, which draws a circle around them, and really prevents, in a sense, deeper depths being tapped. So there is a fine balance, perhaps, that we have to draw in terms of allowing individuals to become individuals, and at the same time requiring individuals to be also members of a society with various kinds of obligations, duties, responsibilities that have to be done and have to be performed, and necessarily involve those individuals in society, in collective pursuits, and interaction with other human beings. So there is a difficult balance that has to be drawn, and institutions undoubtedly would play some critical role in that. And perhaps we might say, in the end, that what we're talking about really is a restoration of something if we're going to have a new kind of civilization emerge. We might here be speaking of a restoration of naturalness. Very difficult to define, but a restoration of what was once very natural, varying from a love of an idea to the appreciation of the qualities, gifts, even the experience, efforts, and failures of others. A real sense of an ability to communicate with other human beings in very informal contexts and situations, where there's no status consciousness involved, where when people actually come together, whether it's at work, at home, in friendship, in certain settings like this and other kinds, they're able to put their minds naturally on what is essential, and not in terms of who and what they belong to, and whether it's male or female or old or young or a businessman or this or that, where the stereotypes are not really involved, even though they have their legitimate place. At work, so-and-so is my supervisor, so-and-so is my helper, so-and-so is something else. But still, an ability to bring to those relationships an element of relaxation, in the hippie sense perhaps, but in the sense also that it has to do with the coming closer with other minds, a deeper communication with other minds and other hearts, which undoubtedly would have to do with civilization and self-consciousness. So perhaps we just might say that really in the end it seems, at least to the speaker, that it has to do fundamentally, civilization and self-consciousness, with learning and embodying, with what in a sense one becomes and what in a sense one is able to manifest, or one is able to offer to other human beings. Thank you very much.
Yes, sorry, we had some gaps I forgot to warn you about, but nonetheless, we were trying to give you something of the conceptual flavor, and then something of what was involved in death and regeneration from the standpoint of civilizations and disengagement from a loss of meaning. The part we didn't cover was where it was dealing with alienation, and it was and the notion that a lot of individuals now across the globe, but certainly in America and elsewhere, were so increasingly alienated from the institutional meanings that were being promoted by various things from education to work and so forth, such that was, in a sense, a precursor. Because when you start disengaging from the whole apparatus of the socially imposed meanings, you might say, which had a value, certainly had a value in a point in time, certainly were a formulation of the fundamental principles of liberty and equality and a sense of justice that we at least theoretically held up to be important. What we discovered increasingly in America is not that alienation was necessarily connected with labor, which it did become in time and work, but it led to a search for a new search of meaning, which was elaborated in terms of religion as an example of that. And one sees it. I've been to ceremonies personally, speaking at the personal level now, where someone would combine. I had students once who said, I just got married 3 months ago, and my husband is a Buddhist and I'm a Catholic. And so you can imagine what it was like when we went to our parents to say that we were going to get married. And what we ended up having to get both our sets of parents together, and we engaged in a kind of careful dialogue in which finally, out of that, came a way in which, a modality in which we could respectfully bring together both families in such a way that they felt that they were honored. And they did this in this case by having a ceremony of a Buddhist kind, which involves something from the readings of Jesus. And then on the other side, something from the teaching of the Buddha Dhammapada that were germane to marriage, they're germane to commitment. I then had another couple who built into the same ceremony both the Jewish and the Christian. So you had two different things kind of be woven together creatively. And they worked, apparently. I was present at one. But so that the alienation in the sense in America was necessary, a kind of destructuring that occurred. And this allowed people then to engage and become more open to rediscovering the spiritual behind and within the religious. By rejecting the religious and also not falling prey necessarily to a materialistic scientist approach, people were beginning to look for, what can we do that's natural? What is it that's a humane value? When we look at the whole globe, not just America, we begin to discover there really, a lot of people have something to offer. And people return to nature. Nature became the cathedral for many Americans, young Americans, walking the John Muir Trail or something of that sort, which is very wonderful to people. Going to Concord, Massachusetts, sitting by the lake, of Walden Pond. We witnessed some young couple when we were walking around Walden, sitting down, and it was beautiful. She was in a posture right next to the lake of listening, and he was reading to her from Walden. So you see the different ways in which people rediscover a kind of quest in America for new frontiers of being, as Raghavan used to point out repeatedly. The new frontiers are not physical; they're spiritual and psychological and ethical, and that's what people are trying to do. But through what is being lost, something is being germinated, so that in time it can fructify, but not without pain, not without suffering, because no birth is ever possible that's painless. Even natural childbirth is painless. I've been present at 4. So it's anyway. So that's just to give you a little background of what you didn't hear, so that you kind of see how he got into universal individuation and universalization, which means we have to see a hyphen that connects what it means to be a fully developed human being and what it means, and that it necessarily involves engagement in your community. You can't just go on a separate trip, a head trip. Nor can you just see participation as being anything and everything, because you have to also reflect. You have to also make discoveries. And that helps you understand other human beings. So you can actually individuate other human beings. If you really individuate, you learn to see them as how they see themselves, but go beyond it. If they see themselves as a Muslim, then you can accept that, but you can then go beyond it. And so that allows you to see them not through just a single prism, but to see them as unfolding human beings, and then see in the prism, see in them being a Muslim, what is fine, what reflects the finest human qualities. So that's why to individuate is also involves in universalization. And universalization reinforces and enriches your conception of self. So the circle of selfhood begins to gain through diversity. Isn't it interesting? To individuate is to be able to handle more and more diversity. So you have this paradox, seemingly, which is not a paradox. It's just a psychologically different way of looking at the world. So therefore, quiet. Okay, now go ahead. Points, questions, hopefully commentaries, examples, whatever.
Jonathan?
Yeah. Do you want to just call on people and just notice the raised hands, or do you want me to do it? Totally up to you.
Yes, sure.
Okay, you'll handle that. Okay, good. All right. Okay, Jim. Wow. And Michelle, thank you for having the wisdom to have talked Jim into this. So anyway, that was magnificent. So I was really interested in this thing about death, because in other words, when I first thought of the title for this presentation, Civilization, Death, and Regeneration, we see all this destruction around us and so forth. And then the theory is that, well, hopefully in the aftermath, coming up from the ashes, so to speak. There'll be some kind of a phoenix thing that'll be good. But what you've done with your presentation is you've said, wait a minute, you've done a whole different thing with death. It sounds to me like you were working on that from the individual standpoint, and that's where to focus on this. And so instead of thinking about the death of the civilization, you could do this really like Platonic preparation for death, this philosophical mode of philosophy as a preparation for death. So it becomes like an inward spiritual dimension, and that's a way to look through this. And you mentioned some things here. One of it had to do with examining what are your values, and let's see here, what is essential, and sifting. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that. And also what do you want? You said, what do I want?
Yeah.
And what am I prepared to commit? And so forth. All that somehow had to do with this mystery of thinking of this in terms of death.
Okay, I'll make a general comment first, and if you have anything to add to that. That's a very, very good question. And it's true. The emphasis of the talk put it back more on individuals consciously disengaging. But what often happens, and why a civilization, it was pointed out to me. When I say talk, please understand, these points were made by Raghavan, and I was just simply articulating them. So we'll just take care of that. So now here's the thing in the talk. It points out at the beginning that every civilization, in a sense, as Plato pointed out, goes through cycles. Okay? What does it mean? You can have an incredible vision, and you can have this articulated by great founders from Solon on to Ashoka, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can have these wonderful visualizations that become assimilated by a culture and crystallized into practices and codes and laws that affect relationships. And then you can have training in the families and later on in educational institutions that help you develop skill in dealing with people at your own age, people older. What are the appropriate deferences you show? What's your tone of voice? What's your way? How helpful are you? How much can you forget yourself? How much can you be relied upon? How much are you trustworthy? All these things are dealt with in high civilizations. But what happens in time, when you get something so magnificent and so well done and so integrated, people in time become passive. They become to where they unconsciously become preservers only. And then there's a problem. When that happens, they close themselves off to the innovators, to the pioneers, to people who say, you know what, this is wonderful. We had it for a while, but we need to think afresh. We need to think a new way. So when this happens, instead of allowing for the people who are iconoclasts, give them some margin. Instead of allowing for the pioneers with a new formulation of old things or a new vision entirely, they begin to set it off, and then people become very sentimental. They start, oh, look at what we used to have, and look at this, look at that, and pretty soon they are in caskets. They have monolisms. I'm sorry, Muslim about grave sites about the past, and they keep putting that history as though it's true now. They rewrite it. They bring it forward because they want to use the glow of the past to legitimate what they're doing in the present. And here he says, what happens then is what needs to be done is people who are honest, who are truthful, say, look, this is not acceptable anymore. But they also have to have the courage to know they're part of the problem. So can they generate a new sense of self that allows them to see ahead and to act in a way that's different, right? This is the difference that was being pointed out between an academic and intellectual look at something and a committed look. It's not until you make a commitment about anything you studied or any ethics you assume that it begins to become real to you, and it begins to have an influence on others, and you begin to see the potential in others. It's like when you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's no longer you're comparing religions, but you say, okay, what does that mean to me, to anyone in this particular culture, in the particular institutions that we have? how corrupt are they? Are they salvable or not? Well, that's painful. But you then find people who have like concerns, and you can begin to revisualize and reinitiate something.
It's very well said. One thing that I wanted to add is that I feel like in our society, we very often want to wait around for the collective to make a decision together. We need to have a conversation. And I think that if we are able to get down to basics within ourselves, ask questions, and try to exemplify that within our individual sphere, that itself will become contagious in a sense. And the integrity that springs from that will, I think, help leaven the lump, so to speak.
It's very Thoreauian.
David?
Okay. See, how do you turn this on here? Okay. Oh yeah, as kind of a counterpoint to all that you presented tonight, and you remind me a lot of the great work that was being done in the 70s in the area you're talking about, like the books by Jacob Needleman, the New Religions, and people broadening their view of all the different pathways and roads of life, and especially in the spiritual religious ways. People like Theodore Roszak, you probably remember Where the Wasteland Ends, things like that. But now we're fast forwarding like 50, 60 years, and we're up against certain forces, I would say, of homogenization in the world, and international international capital and all those forces seem to be more strongly in play than they did in that more sort of hopeful time of late 70s, 80s, coming out of Vietnam, civil rights, and I'm wondering, how we can fuse those ideas.
I think so. Go ahead. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
How we can fuse those ideas from the 70s and 80s, maybe, and how we can implement them in today's culture, because it is somewhat different. That what people are up against, people growing up and all, they don't always have the luxury of thinking about individualization and things like that. They're trying to pay the bills and deal with all sorts of things that we're all aware of in the world today. And just the polarization. I mean, we couldn't even a single party until yesterday, they couldn't even agree on the Speaker of the House, right? I mean, it's pretty bizarre, really. The polarization, to me anyway, it seems worse than 40 or 50 years ago. So anyway, I thought maybe you could address a little bit of that, the changing history. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I think you bring up excellent points. And I think that at the time that talk was given, it hadn't gotten quite as bad, but in order to regenerate, we need to go through a collective suffering in a way. And it's important during that darkness or that suffering that we don't lose hope of what is, golden. And that's where, through our suffering, that's when we need to ask those questions. And I understand what you're speaking about, where not everyone has the luxury that all other people do. But, speaking from personal experience, I do think that we always have the choice to think differently, even if we are in economic hardship. To say that we don't is, I don't know, abdicating responsibility in a sense. And that's exactly what humanity needs to do at this time, is to step up and to realize that our thoughts our feelings, the way that we interact with every human being. That's what we need to change. It's little small steps, and it's a drop by drop approach. And I would just say, don't lose hope.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful line of thought.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Because in a sense, I would think it's even a greater challenge in a way for someone today to individuate in one sense than it was in the 70s.
Right.
Because there's so much political correctness now that has entered into every arena of engagement with the world, particularly through media, social media and television, that institutions are almost becoming gridlocked. That is, even University of Chicago, which honors its freedom, it has had to fight a battle for intellectual freedom and inviting people onto campus who have a different view. That is inconceivable in the 60s and 70s. You invite people on who had radical views, communists. But now it's so absurdly polarized. Well, that's the virtue of it. As well, the polarization is so great. The attempt to impose, whether it's through COVID or whether it's through political correctness, the attempt to impose a false homogeneity is a serious problem. Now, to give an example of what Michelle was just mentioning, we several of us just returned from Chennai. When we were in the hotel, I approached a young woman who's someone who stands out in the lobby and will engage people if they wish to engage. And so she saw me and she said hello, and so we started a conversation. And she said, "Now tell me," and she said, "I'm 30 years old." That came up in the conversation. She's 30 years old. She said, "Now, how do you see Madras? Do you see it any differently than when you were here in '83?" And I said, "Well, I haven't seen very much of Madras at all, but I have witnessed a few things, that you encounter with certain people. And my impression is this." And she said, "Your impression is very interesting, but it's not really very correct." I said, "Okay, good. Now correct me." She said, "Yes, I will." She said, "Since we're having a frank conversation." I said, "Wonderful." She said, "I'm a Shaivite, and I can tell you, and I'm 30 years of age, and I can tell you, people of my generation in India, they at age of 15, 16, they want to go and visit a sacred site."
Hmm.
I said, "Really?" I said, "Now, what about puja at home?" She says, "Oh, yes, we still have them. But in my generation, this desire to go and visit a sacred site is very real. And when they get in their 20s and they're working, they arrange to be able to go do it." And she said, for example, there's a certain sacred site about Shiva, and I don't remember what it was. She said, "There are many, many of them." And she said, "But often they come back, they're not quite sure what they were supposed to find." And she said, "Now, for myself, I have the desire to go to a sacred site, but I'm waiting until I really feel the call, and then I'm going to go." And so I said to her, "Now, let me ask you a question. Two things can happen, right? Logically. You have an experience that is revolutionary of some kind. It's a realization, because they're looking for experience, some kind of spiritual experience when they go to a sacred site." And she says, "Many come back without a spiritual experience." I said, "Now, your desire to wait till you're feeling like you really want to go and you're prepared for it, that's excellent. But if you get there and you have no experience, can you then, of course, say nothing happened?" I said, "I hadn't thought of it that way." I said, "That's important, because something could have happened, but you're not necessarily aware of what has happened. So you should not get discouraged and lose hope. because who knows what will affect you in dreams? Who knows what affects you at some other level of yourself? And who knows it won't become apparent later on that something did happen, but you weren't in the proper state of mind to be able to understand it. And all those other friends of yours, you should let them know that just because they had no experience, spiritual experience, doesn't mean that something wasn't happening at that sacred spot. You have to be patient. Don't look for immediate things. And she said, that was very helpful. She said, what I said was helpful. I said, yes, it was. I didn't know these things. So there's an example of, and oh, by the way, what she used was the main phrase that got me going. She said, I want you to know Hindus nowadays are thinking differently. That's what she said. I thought was what she said. We're thinking differently. And that's when I said, well, what are you talking about? She said, the spiritual quest is different. That's how we got into it. So I'm glad I remembered that because that was her signature point. People thinking differently.
I would just like to add that as a young person, I think this is that stance that young woman was speaking of. I think that is true all over the globe. And the younger generation, I think, is, stereotyped in a certain way. And, even if a spiritual search isn't really manifesting in the way that we would think it traditionally would, I think there's still a very strong pull and desire for such a life. I think when we're able to engage with the youth, when we speak one-on-one and not in a social media kind of a context, people open up. They really do. And I think that is what we need more of, is just, speaking to people. It's something that I think my generation has been so disillusioned by technology and finding everything false in the world. We're really seeking something real. And if it's in human relationships, that's the greatest beginning, I think. Kirk?
Yes, thank you for those comments. And it was a wonderful experience to hear Jim in his late 20s, early 30s, and the way you developed concepts and worked through the talk, in a very natural way, and so many wonderful points made. So it's very, very much appreciated. It was just occurring to me as we were going through the questions and comments that this magnificent idea that HPB spoke about. It's almost like, in fact, in Hermes, it's referred to as the hymnody, which H.P. Blavatsky gave in speaking about the foundation stone of ancient civilizations that was set. The foundation stone of ancient civilizations, the first solar dynasties, that was set by enlightened beings. Right. In fact, descending from and participating in our cycle of evolution from previous cycles of evolution, in order to teach mankind the arts and sciences and the true basis of true civilization, and that, in some sense, what we know of today as theosophy or theosophia is likewise a similar attempt to recollect the ideas and the concepts of human nature, the concepts of the divine, the concepts of God, man, and nature, which can provide the real basis for the regeneration of true culture and true civilizations of the future. So it's like if I understand it correctly, that the effort of theosophy is in fact to try and reestablish those fundamental bases of true civilization through the propagation of the ideas that have been handed down to us by great teachers and masters. And in fact, just to connect it up more specifically, we're recollecting that Judge speaks of karma and reincarnation as being, the importance of them is that they're the basis of ethics. Because we lost the basis for ethical practice. Why? Because the metaphysical foundations were lost, even though they were repeatedly, promoted by Christianity and other traditions. The underlying metaphysics was missing, and so they lacked the depth of that a seeking mind needs in order for them to take hold in consciousness and so on. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, the role of Theosophia in reestablishing the foundations of true civilization.
Well, you're in a sense talking, you could take the myth of Prometheus as being something of the Greek paradigm to this, of Prometheus making the sacrifice to take the knowledge of the gods, the fire, the thrice sacred fire from Mount Olympus down to Acadia, and to light up the minds of humanity who were in darkness, in mental darkness. So in a sense, if you take that as a paradigm of the great dynasties that took place millions of years ago, right? So the question becomes, like you say, okay, in what sense can Theosophia do something analogous that's appropriate to our particular point in evolution, which is now many millions of years later, although some of this also occurred during in the early days of Atlantis too. But if you look at, and the age of Rama was said theosophically to be 1 million years ago. So there, it's, the teachings are in a sense an appeal to the inner fire that still exists and still has a connection with what the Dhyanis did during a previous period. But to access it involves a period of self-purification. And when ideas are taken seriously, like they're presented in the Secret Doctrine or by HPB or by Rogerman or by others, when they are presented and they are taken as a way of looking at the world and thinking about the world and eventually living in the world, they begin to weave their own fabric, their own vesture, which then becomes a vesture that is capable of re-reflecting the golden light of higher manas. So that it's through monastic ideas that we begin to awaken the aspirations to live a better life. Because when we're given a vision, it's like one Native American tribe would say, go out and have a vision. Visions, because they energize you. They make you go from being, latent to being kinetic. But you have to, one of the things theosophy does is it helps us to temper the psychic, not to get enthusiasm to the point to where you tilt, you lose balance too much. Going back to the teachings again, they help you true yourself. They help you true and regain balance. But it's a dynamic balance, right? And as you talk about it with others and you come together, and what he says about suddenly you really are mind to mind, heart to heart. That's the Vedic ideal, right? The Vedic ideal is of one mind, one heart, one lip, one deliberate, and you deliberate together. When you conspire together for the good, as Tolstoy said, magic happens because higher beings can use it. They can influence it. They can infuse it. They can accelerate it. They can allow it to become seminal. So whether it's if it's a few people that gathered together for transcendentalists in America, they formed a kind of community that was a different kind of community. They were in and yet above concord. They had something that was in the realm of the universal. And therefore it had a subtle efflux. And anyone who connects with it, who goes and reads Thoreau or goes and reads Emerson, even if he loses you, you can sense something that's pure, purifying, and makes the mind and the heart together. And you want to see that kind of love. And you want, like Thoreau said, to reshape the atmosphere in which you live, in which you think, in which you choose. And choosing becomes far different than what we normally call choosing, because it's connected with something that gives it a deep meaning. And you know it connects up to the welfare of others. This is back to Jonathan's question. You know, collectively, a lot is collapsing, and a lot is polarizing. And those are wise who see that and make a choice to not only save themselves, but to think in terms of ideas that are humane and link up across the globe to other people who have needs and other people who show an incredible forbearance under times of trial. I remember, did any of you ever see that thing about where in Myanmar there was terrible slaughter going on, and this woman, I think maybe Pico said it, was looking at a picture of the Buddha, lost her children, lost this, lost that, incredible grief. But she linked up with something that was deeper, something spiritual that meant something to her. And that soothed her grief. And she thought and felt different. And that's benefiting from something that is deeper and that she chooses to honor. And that's strengthening.
Shobha?
Yeah, I was struck by the word civilization, and I think Mr. Iyer did talk about the meaning of civilization, but I'd like to carry it deeper and talk about the common understanding of the word civilization versus tribal people, indigenous people, and the general concept of how it is understood and how those ideas do sink into the subconscious of so-called woke people. I had to use that word. So I think it's important to even comment on even that word, civilization, how we as students of theosophy have to redirect that word and look at it more carefully, because society in general looks at that word like civilizing this group of people, the colonial period, the imperial period, even now, the misunderstanding of different groups of people, or using the word exotic to kind of mysteria, to make it a mystery. Both words I can't stand because they still don't make us understand people.
Well, I'm not quite, besides, you have something to say? Besides I think the point was being made about the core has to do with civilization. The core is being civil. That itself is a very deep, multi-dimensional word. And it involves the postulation of certain universal principles and values that seem to be enduring and seem to be those kind of values that link up to brotherhood. But they require a transformation of self in order to be able to make them, exemplify them in practice. Because it was pointed out, you have to rethink what you think the self is. And whenever you encounter something that's really an ethical ideal, it forces all of us to say, gee, in what sense do I think this is possible? That's saying something about oneself. If one believes that it's possible and sees civilization as fundamentally an ethical notion that requires you to take this ethical notion, this ideal, and translate it into particular laws or institutions that are attempting to foster it and counter all the evil and all the influences that are against it, because everything is in this kind of war. You can't bring the good into existence. You cannot honor anything unless you also deal with the opposite. And that's just the way it is. But one of the things I think you learn theosophically is when you begin to reflect on human nature and you begin to realize that it has so many modes of expression of any one thing, it allows you, in a sense, to do what Socrates said, to become transcultural. And it begins with raising questions. And Socrates, once you begin to raise questions about concepts and to clarify them and see what they imply, you begin to change the mind. You begin to become more sensitive and more discriminating. Think about how, as Theosophists, we're not interested in making big judgments about primitive cultures or about any other culture or about any particular religion. That's because we're learning the principle of discretion and discrimination. You learn in time to sift out what is good in anything, what is good in almost any form. And you're not necessarily attached to a particular form of political organization or social structure or whatever. So to me, that's the beautiful nature of it. It's free and fearless, and it's flexible.
Thank you.
Well, I think our time is pretty much up, and we thank you very, very much. I would like to just read a couple of the quotes from the Aquarian Almanac that caught my eye this week. First of all, today is the Coptic Christmas, so Merry Christmas if you're a Coptic. The Mahayana New Year, so Happy New Year. And there is a quote from Robert Crosby for Tuesday, because apparently that's his birthday, January 10. So he says, if only once any considerable number of persons could take the true position and act from the true nature, right ideas would soon spread all over the earth. So that is very, very optimistic. And then there's another quote that caught my eye from William James, and that's for Wednesday. He says, all the higher, more penetrating ideals are revolutionary. They present themselves far less in the guise of effects of past experience than in that of probable causes of future experience. So with all this wisdom that Theosophy has to offer, it's ultimately, in the long term of things, very potent and very revolutionary, it seems like. So I thank you very, very much for offering this presentation. It turned out to be a brilliant move to do it the way you did, I think. And it's fun to hear Jim Tepper's voice when he was 35.
Yeah.
And okay, so next week we will have a presentation on deity, transcendent, and immanent. And this is so important in understanding philosophy and religion, really. And then the week after that, I'll just point out again, there'll be a presentation on that thou art. Thank you all very much for your participation. And thank you, Michelle and Jim.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Hey, Helena, anytime. I didn't do anything. So
Thank you, Jim and Michelle.
You're welcome.
everybody take care. Have a good week.